There's a wheel in the corner of this barn, stone gray and heavy, mounted in a wooden frame with a footboard underneath. It's thick as a wagon wheel but rough as river rock, and there's a shallow trough carved into the wood below it to catch water. The frame is worn smooth where hands gripped it 1,000 times. Take a good look. Do you know what this was for? Most people today have no idea. But 150 years ago, every farmstead in America had one, and without it, the work simply couldn't get done. This is a foot treadle grindstone, and it was the beating heart of tool maintenance on the American homestead. Before hardware stores, before replacement blades, before you could order anything online, a farmer's tools had to last a lifetime and they had to stay sharp. The scythe that cut hay, the axe that split winter wood, the hoe that broke garden soil, kitchen knives, shears, chisels, everything dulled with use, and everything had to be sharpened by hand. Here's how it worked. You'd fill that wooden trough with water. Then you'd sit on a stool or stand beside the frame, one foot on that treadle board, and pump it like a spinning wheel. The wheel would turn, and as it spun, you'd hold your blade against the wet stone at just the right angle. The water kept the stone cool and washed away the metal dust. A good grindstone was made from sandstone, quarried from places like Ohio or Pennsylvania, and the grit determined whether you got a rough edge or a razor finish. The rhythm was hypnotic. Pump, turn, grind. Pump, turn, grind. Your grandfather's grandfather knew that rhythm in his bones. What's clever about the foot treadle design is that it freed both hands. You could hold the tool steady, adjust the angle, feel the edge taking shape. It was human-powered, infinitely repairable, and if you cracked the stone, a good stonemason could dress it true again. These grindstones disappeared when electric bench grinders arrived in the early 20th century. Faster, yes, but they ran so hot they could ruin the temper of fine steel if you weren't careful. The old-timers knew better. They knew the patient way. Let's step inside the farmhouse kitchen now to a time when autumn meant apples, barrels of them, bushels from the orchard that had to be peeled, cored, and sliced for pies, for drying, for sauce, for cider. A woman could stand at the table with a paring knife for hours, but if she had one of these, the work went 10 times faster. The apple parer was a cast iron marvel, usually bolted right to the kitchen table. It had a 3-pronged fork on one end that you'd stick into the apple, and a hand crank on the other. Between them, a curved blade on a clever hinged arm. You'd turn the crank and the apple would spin on the fork while the blade rode along its surface, peeling the skin away in one long, continuous ribbon. Some models had a coring blade too, and a slicing attachment that would spiral the whole apple into perfect rings as it turned. The really fine ones were made by companies like Goodell or Reading Hardware, names stamped right into the iron, and they're collector's pieces now. Picture a farmwife in October, jars waiting to be filled, wood stove hot, a mountain of apples on the table. She'd peel 40, 50, 60 apples in the time it used to take to do a dozen by hand. The children would fight over who got to eat the long peel ribbons. That's the kind of detail that doesn't make it into history books, but it's the truth of how people lived. These parers vanished when store-bought applesauce became cheaper than making your own, and when orchards gave way to supermarkets. You can still find them at estate sales, rust-red and frozen with age, sold to people who hang them on walls and never turn the crank, down in the cold cellar, or sometimes in a summer kitchen out back. There was another tool that turned raw harvest into preserved food. The sausage press, or sausage stuffer as some called it, was how farm families turned butchering day into food for the winter. When you slaughtered a hog, nothing went to waste. The cuts became hams and chops, the fat became lard, and the trim, the shoulders, the tougher cuts, those became sausage. You'd grind the meat, mix it with salt and sage and pepper, and then you needed to get it into casings. The sausage press was a heavy tin or iron cylinder with a plunger that fit inside and a nozzle at the bottom. You'd soak the casings, usually hog intestines cleaned and turned, and slide one onto that nozzle like a sock. Then you'd pack the cylinder with your seasoned meat, and one person would crank or push the plunger down while another guided the casing as it filled, pinching and twisting it into links. It was messy work. It was cold work, done in November or December when the weather was right for keeping meat. But it was also community work. Neighbors helped neighbors on butchering day, and everyone went home with sausages. The clever part of the design was the pressure control. A good press let you fill the casings firm but not so tight they'd burst when you cooked them. That was the art of it. These tools disappeared when commercial meat packing took over, when refrigeration made year-round fresh meat possible, and when people stopped raising their own hogs. Now sausage comes in plastic on a foam tray, and we've forgotten what it took to make it by hand. Did your grandfather have one of these in his shed or hanging in the barn? Tell me below. I'd love to hear the stories. Back in the kitchen, there was another rhythm that defined farm life, especially in the springtime when the cows were fresh and giving milk. The butter churn, and specifically the butter churn paddle, sometimes called a dasher, was the tool that turned cream into butter. You've probably seen the tall wooden churns, the ones that look like narrow barrels with a lid and a long stick poking through the top. That stick had a paddle or dasher on the bottom end, a cross-shaped piece of wood with holes in it. You'd pour fresh cream into the churn, and then you'd work that paddle up and down, for 20 minutes, sometimes longer. The motion forced the cream through those holes, agitating it, breaking up the fat globules until they clumped together into butter. You'd hear it change. First a sloshing sound, then a thicker slap, and finally you'd feel the butter solids forming and the thin buttermilk separating out. It was arm work. Hard, repetitive, and usually given to the older children or the housewife. Some families sang churning songs to pass the time. The butter would come out pale and soft, and you'd work it with paddles to press out the last of the liquid, then salt it and pack it into crocks. The dasher paddle itself was simple, just shaped wood, but the design mattered. Too small and you'd be there all day. Too rough and it would splinter into the butter. A good dasher was smooth, balanced, and sized right for the churn. These disappeared when hand-cranked barrel churns arrived, and those disappeared when dairy factories and refrigerated trucks made butter a grocery item instead of a kitchen task. Now we forget that butter was ever made by hand at all. Out in the barn, or sometimes strung up in the corn crib, you'd find another tool born of necessity. The corn dryer, which sounds simple until you understand the problem it solved. Corn had to be dried before it could be stored, or it would rot and mold through the winter. You could hang ears from the rafters or spread them on screens, but if you had a lot of corn and limited space, you needed something better. Corn dryers were wooden racks or wire frames, sometimes tiered like shelves, designed to hold ears of corn in a way that let air circulate all around them. Some were simple ladder-like frames you'd lean against the barn wall. Others were elaborate rotating drums, hand-cranked, that tumbled the ears to dry them evenly. The Pennsylvania Germans made beautiful ones from bent willow and wire. The trick was airflow and time. Hang the corn too tight and the center ears would mold. Spread it right in a dry barn with good ventilation, and by midwinter you'd have hard, dry corn ready to shell for cornmeal or chicken feed. The kernels would rattle on the cob when they were ready. You'd know by the sound. These dryers disappeared when hybrid corn varieties bred for faster field drying arrived, and when mechanical grain dryers powered by propane made the whole process industrial. The old racks were chopped for kindling or left to collapse in forgotten barns. Every one of these tools tells the same story. They were born from necessity, designed by people who couldn't run to a store, who had to make do, who had to think through problems with their hands. They were built to last, to be repaired, to be handed down. And they disappeared not because they didn't work, but because we changed. We wanted speed. We wanted convenience. We traded the foot treadle for the electric motor, the churn paddle for the dairy case, the apple parer for the jar of sauce. There's no judgment in that. Progress is real, and few of us would choose to go back to butchering hogs in December or churning butter until our arms ached. But something was lost too. The knowledge of how things were made, the rhythm of seasonal work, the self-reliance that came from knowing you could sharpen your own tools, preserve your own food and make it through winter on what your hands and your land provided. These tools are still out there, in barns and basements, at farm auctions and flea markets, rusted, forgotten, sometimes unrecognizable. But each one was held by hands that built this country, one task at a time, one season at a time, and each one has a story worth remembering. If you guessed it before the reveal, you know your history. Subscribe, a forgotten tool rediscovered every day.